Why the TOEFL iBT? Well, according to ETS, the educational testing service that produces the TOEFL test, the TOEFL iBT measures your ability to use and understand English at the university level, and it evaluates how well you combine your listening, reading, speaking, and writing skills to perform academic tasks. More than 27 million people from all over the world have taken the TOEFL to demonstrate their English language proficiency. The average English skill level ranges between intermediate and advanced. Now, the first thing I would like to comment here from ETS's website is that I think you'll find the TOEFL test really is a very high-level English test. So when they state here at the end that they're talking about the average skill ranges between intermediate and advanced, I would definitely say that you need to be at least at the advanced level in order to do well on the test. So, in this introductory video, we're going to address the aspects of the TOEFL reading section through a series of questions. And these are particular questions that I've heard from several of my students over the years when they want to know more about the test and how they can prepare for it. So we're going to begin here with question number 1. Now, some of my students have had experience taking the TOEFL before, but in general most have not. So one of the first questions I hear is about reading passages themselves. Are the reading passages on the test easier than those you would find in a college textbook? Well, first off, no. Now, some students, if they've taken the older versions of the TOEFL, the paper-based and computer-based test, which of course the computer-based test is gone, and the paper-based test will be gone in the middle of 2012, they used to use simplified reading material, so we would call that adulterated. And it was sort of a major complaint from many teachers, such as myself, and universities alike. Many felt that the reading material was just not the same level that you would find at the university level. So what they've done is they've taken now many selections from actual freshman level textbooks and only made slight alterations. So for example, the length may not be necessarily what you would see in a textbook, but certainly it's a lot longer than you found on the old TOEFL test. And of course I do believe the reading level is much more difficult. So I think really the idea is, one of the goals was to maintain the integrity of the level of vocabulary that you would see. I think this was a big problem for many teachers. They would see a big difference between students, native students who would study for different tests that were higher level vocabulary, and the TOEFL would be not as high. Also, the test is helping students focus on the reading skills they need to be successful at the freshman level. So I think in a way the test has made big improvements in that respect. Now, looking at the reading section design, the length of each reading passage is approximately 700 words, so that's quite a bit. That's, basically looking at an entire page full of text. Then, in terms of each number of passages, they're generally 3 to 5 on the test, and you will see anywhere from 12 to 14 questions per passage. Now, depending on how many passages you have, generally the timing is from 60 to 100 minutes. So if you think about it, if you go back to the number of passages, that's basically about 20 minutes or so per passage. Now the good news is, of course, with the reading section, that the sections themselves are not specifically timed. So you could take longer than 20 minutes to answer questions and read on a passage, but it's probably not recommended. So that's something to keep in mind, that depending on the number of passages you have, you generally do need to spend, around 20 minutes or so on each one. So what should we do in this case? Well, the thing I usually stress to my students is you definitely need to improve your English, but specifically your level of vocabulary. The number one way, in my opinion, to improve your knowledge of English is learning more vocabulary. So on the TOEFL, understanding academic vocabulary is an absolute must. Now, many students want to say, well, where can I begin? Well, one resource that I find very effective is the academic word list. And this was basically put together about 11, 12 years ago. I'm going to the website now. Put together by the Professor Avril Coxhead in Australia. And this particular list basically was a thesis an academic thesis to kind of figure out, which particular words are going to be the most helpful for students. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on the academic word list, but you can find a lot of the information here at Avril Coxhead official page. And as you click on these particular links, you will see that each one will kind of talk about how the list was developed. Again, it includes words that are considered to be the most frequent across many, many different academic disciplines. And of course, what's great here is that on the website you can go through and look at the actual lists of words. You can actually study them. And of course, there are several other websites now that have been developed where you can understand how many where you can practice with the academic word list itself. So I think this is definitely a good place for students to begin. There are several hundred words there that basically all successful university students really should know. Now, let's be clear though, obviously I don't think academic vocabulary is the only thing. But let's define, for example, the difference between academic and technical vocabulary. As we said earlier, according to the word list, academic vocabulary are words that you can find across a variety of academic disciplines, especially when you read. So, for example, the word analysis has basically the same meaning in science class, history class, and so on, though the methods that you might find of analysis may be different. Technical vocabulary, on the other hand, are sometimes referred to as terminology, sometimes even referred to as jargon, are words that are discipline-specific. So these are words that you would find, perhaps, and defined by their specific context. So, and in other words, you may see them across different contexts, though sometimes maybe not, but they would have different meanings. So, for example, a bond that you might study in a chemistry class would be different from something you might study in, say, a child psychology course in terms of a bond between a mother and a child. Now, in my opinion, obviously I think you need to improve your academic vocabulary, but I do think, and something we will address here in just a moment, you do need to improve your technical vocabulary as well, if you want to do better on the test. Question number 2. So, when we get to the reading passage, should we read all of it at the beginning? So the first time we see it, should we read the entire passage before we answer questions? And the answer is no. One of the problems, of course, is the time limit on the test. So reading everything, taking a lot of time to read everything at the beginning, would probably take too much time. It would be impossible for you to even remember what you've read if you begin to start answering the questions. Because remember, those passages are around 700 words long. Now, some students prefer just to go straight to the questions. I think that might be a good strategy, but only after you have gotten a lot of experience taking the test. So in this particular video, what we're trying to address is those students who may not have a lot of experience with the TOEFL. So the question here is, what should you do? Well, we're going to discuss very briefly the difference between reading and skimming. Now, reading, when we talk about a reading passage or reading something, we generally are referring to the idea of paying close attention so that we can understand the text very deeply. And in fact, sometimes we may need to read a text several times in order to understand its complete meaning. Now again, reading, of course, is a very active process. It's reorganizing information. It's often simplifying or rephrasing words so that we can understand it. That's not the purpose of this video, to talk about reading too deeply, but you will see that we will address it throughout our video series. Skimming, on the other hand, is when you look over a passage very quickly, and this is to help establish the kind of basic organization of a passage, and also to get the basic idea or gist. And really, you should not you should not do this many times on the test, maybe no more than twice at the beginning. So, because time's going to be very short. So, are we saying that you shouldn't read anything? Should you skim everything at the beginning? Well, not exactly. The key here, the real trick, is to know when and what to read, and when and what to skim. And again, we're talking about at the beginning when you see a passage for the first time. So really what I want us to think about here is how the organization of an academic reading passage really matters. Now, as we get a little bit further along in the video series, we will discuss how certain academic texts are organized. But in general, academic texts are usually organized this way. First off, we know that the beginning paragraph is referred to as the introduction. And oftentimes this is where a lot of the main information of the passage will be contained. So the introduction will become very important to us here in just a moment. The body of the reading generally contains between 3 to 4 paragraphs on the TOEFL. And this information is also very important, of course, because it provides that detailed explanation and breakdown of information we see in the introduction. But this information often is becoming much more specific. And this is where it gets very difficult to try to remember all of it. So again, trying to do that would not be very easy, especially if you try to read it before you see questions. And then sometimes you will see on the TOEFL an actual conclusion, where they kind of review information or they kind of finish up with the idea itself. Now, be advised, there isn't always a formal conclusion on the TOEFL, so you're not necessarily always going to see a finally or a conclusive idea, but you may see sort of the last piece of information as described at the beginning with the body. So the key is to think about, well, reading is a very valuable thing, and at some point we're going to have to read the information, right? Well, the key is to recognize where the most important information is located, so that you can try to understand that main idea the first time you see the text. Now, where do you think this information would be? Well, if you said the introduction, congratulations. But we can also find a lot of helpful information that we need to know in the beginning sentence, oftentimes referred to as the topic sentence of each paragraph in the body. So, therefore, the first time you see the text, you should really try to read the introduction. Give it some time, maybe a minute, 2 minutes, to just basically make sure you understand where the paragraph is going. And then especially pay attention to the first sentence of each body paragraph, because these will be valuable in helping you understand the main idea quickly. Now, when should we skim? Well, remember, skimming is a very quick process. So the idea here is, as we move through the text the first time, after you read through the introduction and look at the topic sentences, try to skim the rest of the body content. And that's only just to give you a quick understanding, to confirm or clarify what you think the main idea is going to be. Now, one technique, especially helpful since you're looking at a computer screen, is to use your pointer finger to help you skim through the information like this. Now, this will demonstrate the level of graphics we're using here. But if you notice your hand down at the bottom, notice how when we skim, we kind of just move through the words very quickly, just to kind of get the basic idea as to what it's talking about. So, and let's take a moment to just kind of demonstrate and practice what reading and skimming really are. So, first off, what I want you to do is download the sample TOEFL reading that ETS has given us from the ETS Quick Prep Download packet. Now, this link is also at the bottom of the screen. You will see that I will refer to this throughout the entire video series because this is information that ETS has provided to us. We don't have to worry so much about providing information that has been copyrighted. This information, of course, is publicly available on the web. Now, the first passage is talking about the rise of Teotihuacán. Now, I'm not going to talk about what Teotihuacán is, because really what I want you to do is to find out some of this information just kind of briefly here at the beginning by yourself. So first off, look at the entire reading passage. You'll notice that we have several paragraphs in this reading. Now, what I want you to imagine is that we're seeing the passage for the first time. So, which parts should we read and which parts should we skim? Well, let's start with the introduction. Should we read or skim the introduction? Well, if you recall, I suggested that you read it. So you probably want to take at least 1 or 2 minutes to actually try to read that information. Now, you may not be ready to actually do that right now. You may not be able to read quickly enough in order to understand the information. In fact, it may feel like skimming to you because you're moving so quickly. So here at the beginning, don't worry about how much time it's going to take you on the test. Right now, we're just describing the process. But if you take a couple of minutes and try to read, you will see that the particular paragraph, what the particular story is going to tell us. Okay, now here is the rest of the passage, and of course it's far too small here to actually read on the screen. But the idea is, what should we do? Should I read the rest of the passage or skim through it? Well, if you recall, I suggested that you read the topic sentences, which usually are the first sentences of each paragraph. Now again, reading just means we pay a little more attention to them in this case. But then we might want to just quickly skim the rest of the passage just to pick up some key ideas. Now, again, in our next video, when we start looking at actually answering questions, we will talk a little bit more about the skimming process and how it connects to the questions we're going to see on the test. But for now, we're just going to talk about reading the topic sentence and just skimming the rest of the passage. So again, the topic sentences, I'll kind of use my pen here. So for example, in paragraph 2, we might think of the topic sentence as the first sentence of the paragraph, and looking at it very carefully. So what I can see as I'm already highlighting some of this information is that we're talking about some sort of development. And perhaps the idea is talking about how the Teotihuacán city began, or how it rose. Then I see that we're talking about their natural resources and their ability to recognize the potential, and that it gave the city some sort of advantage over its neighbors. So again, as I'm reading through now, I can see I'm just trying to pick up some very key details. They had trade, and then we see that the picture of Teotihuacán that emerges is a picture of positive feedback among these types of mining that we're looking at: population growth, irrigation, and religious tourism. So as I'm reading through the first sentences, I really get a clear picture that the passage itself is talking a little more deeply about how Teotihuacán developed. And as I'm skimming through, I can see some other key words, such as main factors. So it looks like this paragraph is going to talk to us about what factors are we going to learn on this particular development. And then here I see talking more specifically about the last factor. As I skim through quickly, I see some new words, some names of other places perhaps. I definitely see a confirmation of location. I see something about archaeological evidence. As I'm looking through, I see something about hard volcanic stone. I see other names that are new to me. So again, notice in this skimming process, I'm not necessarily reading it. I'm just looking at some interesting words here. Success, immigrants, so something about people moving into the area perhaps, new inhabitants. Again, dates are always important to kind of pay attention. We're talking obviously several hundred years ago. And then finally I see something again about mining, manufacturing of tools, trading. So again, as I'm just skimming through, I'm noticing some key words and ideas that probably will give me a quick understanding of what the rest of this passage is going to be. But I'm not still ready to read it. That will come later. So right now, don't worry about taking too much time. The idea here for this video series is to teach us these ideas. As you get more comfortable with them, you will get faster at the process. But just to keep this in mind, that on the test, I would probably recommend not spending any more than 5 minutes doing all of that. Reading, selectively reading and skimming at the beginning. Because remember, you have only about 20 minutes to answer all of the questions for each passage. Alright, moving on in our series of questions. So how are the questions organized? Are they organized from easiest to most difficult? Well, no. Some of you might be familiar with the old computer adaptive version, which was out several years ago. And in that case, the questions came out in different orders. But in this case, no. The questions are organized in what we call a linear fashion. So first off, we need to understand how important the questions really are. Obviously, this is the entire purpose of the test, is to answer these questions correctly. Well, this is what we'll concern ourselves for the rest of the video series, is trying to understand those questions. But many times students don't recognize that the purpose of the questions are actually there to help you understand the reading itself. So in other words, as you progress through the text, the questions are trying to reflect what the information is trying to tell you. So, for example, the questions at the beginning of the passage generally will be about information at the beginning. As you progress through the text, you might see questions that depend on understanding something that you read a little bit earlier. So, on the test itself, you will notice there are 10 types of questions, and this is again what we're going to spend the rest of the video series looking at. Now, I'm using the organization from the ETS's official guide to the TOEFL textbook. They organize the information in categories. There are those questions we call detail questions, questions that we call inference questions, vocabulary and reference, questions that involve simplifying sentences or inserting sentences into the passage, and then finally questions we refer to as read to learn. Now, quickly, with the exception of 9 and 10, so we're not going to talk about those at this moment, these particular types of questions you can find several different times throughout the test. Remember, there are about 12 to 14 questions per reading passage. So in this case, you will notice that with the exceptions of questions 9 and 10, you might see some of these other types of questions more than once. So for example, you might find 2 or 3 vocabulary questions, or perhaps 4 referent questions. But on the other hand, you may find only 1 or 2 of the detail type questions throughout the test. So again, there is no consistent pattern that the TOEFL follows when determining the question types, except for the read to learn questions. Now, the read to learn questions, numbers 9 and 10, first off, you will not necessarily see both of them, but you definitely will see at least one of them. The read to learn questions are the last 2 questions that you saw there. And, of course, these particular questions are kind of summarizing everything that you saw in the passage before it. So in this case, the read to learn questions can't be answered at the beginning because you have to have read everything. So therefore, you won't see these questions until you reach the end of the questions on the passage. So again, this is what we were talking about, that the questions themselves will help you understand the text, and then the final question, or questions, will basically ask you about everything you read. So the goal of the reading sections, as we said, we have to answer the questions correctly. So what we're talking about in the rest of the video series is to see how can we identify the question. We need to be able to identify the type of question first, because then that will give you the idea to think about which strategies we need to solve that question. So the objective of this video series is to help you improve your reading approach on the TOEFL, while also helping you learn those question types and applying the right strategies. Question number 5. So this is a question I often get from students. Are we already supposed to know a lot about the topics on the test? Well, this time I'm not going to say no. This time I'm going to say maybe. This is definitely based on my experience. The purpose of the TOEFL test is really to test your reading skills and your ability to learn new information, and not necessarily what you learned previously in your academic schooling. But I will say this right now. From my experience, it really does help if you do have an understanding of a lot of the topics on the test. I think you will notice that on the test, many of the reading passages are not necessarily things that you enjoyed in school, or that you would read for fun, or perhaps maybe you didn't even study. So it does become difficult in this case to think, well, how can we prepare for this test? Well, that's what I tell students here, is that the TOEFL is a reflection a lot of academic content. So my advice would be that you do need to start reading more. And reading more in your everyday life. Now, as we get older, and again, the students I teach are usually adults, we often tend to focus on the things we like to read. So we generally tend to read a lot of the same thing. Well, that's not going to help you on the TOEFL. Remember, the TOEFL is testing your ability to understand academic material across a variety of disciplines: science, history, arts. So you need to start reading things that are more varied and diverse. And in my experience, I have definitely noticed that the TOEFL loves to include subjects or areas that most people do not normally read for fun. So volcanoes, for example, or geography. These are not necessarily things that students read on their own. So our final thoughts in this first video. As we said before, at the beginning of each set of questions, don't try to read the entire passage first. Instead, read that introduction and those topic sentences of the paragraphs very carefully. Then skim the rest of the passage to reinforce your basic understanding, the gist, as we said, that was described and laid out in the introduction. Now, as we said, during the test, this should take you only about 5 minutes. But you're not ready for that now. So in this case, we're trying to learn these behaviors and try to improve on them as we continue through the series. Now, once the questions begin, remember that the questions are not necessarily organized in terms of difficulty, but rather generally where you are in the text. Believe it or not, the questions are organized to actually help you continue to understand the text itself. So remember, this means that you can go back and forth through the questions on the test. And really, this is the only section of the test where you can do this. So remember, the purpose of the questions is to help you learn the meaning of the text in a more detailed way. Believe it or not, by the time you reach the end of the questions, you will have read different parts of the passages several times. When you reach the end of the problem set, remember the final read-to-learn question or questions will help you review the entire passage by asking you to summarize and organize information from the whole text. Now, when it comes to preparing for the test, obviously I hope this video series will be helpful to you, but I also do have some other recommended materials. Of course, there are lots of these materials from the official TOEFL website, which is available at ets.org/TOEFL. And again, a lot of the information we're using here is publicly provided by ETS. Also, the official guide to the TOEFL test by ETS, I believe now they're in the 4th edition, certainly be very helpful as well. You need a good preparation book, and of course, the great thing about ETS is they use actual test-level questions. And then finally, I would recommend our new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, which is being sort of built and created throughout the year as we add information from our courses that we offer here in our program. And you'll find a link below this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 2, General Test Strategy and Detail Questions.